The moment when Burkina Faso's revolutionary leader Ibrahim Traoré sat across from former US President Donald Trump was not, at first glance, the kind of event that seemed destined to echo across the globe. It was framed as yet another podcast conversation, a dialogue between two political figures whose worlds could not be more different. One emerged from the complex struggles of a West African nation, fighting for sovereignty, dignity, and independence from neocolonial influences. The other, a billionaire businessman who rose to the presidency of the most powerful country in the world, surrounded by controversies, charisma, and relentless media attention. Yet, when the cameras started rolling and the microphones caught every breath and every hesitation, something deeply unexpected unfolded. The story is not one of policy discussions or diplomatic negotiations. It is not about trade, military strategy, or the endless debates of international politics. Rather, it is a story of faith, humanity, and vulnerability. It is the story of a revolutionary leader who spoke about Jesus with such sincerity and passion that his words reached beyond religion, beyond politics, beyond the categories that so often divide humanity. And it is the story of a man, Donald Trump, who, despite his reputation for brashness, ego, and defiance, found himself overcome with raw, unguarded emotion. The scene began quietly. The podcast studio was modest in design, soft lighting, a wooden table, microphones mounted carefully, cameras positioned to capture every angle. There was nothing extraordinary about the setting, yet the energy in the room carried an intensity that could not be ignored. Viewers who later watched the viral clip described the air as charged, as though something larger than life was about to be revealed. For those present, there was an almost sacred silence before Ibrahim Traoré began to speak. Traoré did not rush his words. He leaned forward slightly, his hands resting calmly on the table, his eyes steady and full of conviction. His voice was firm but gentle, carrying the weight of a man who has lived through struggle yet refuses to surrender to bitterness. He spoke not as a politician delivering talking points, but as a human being reflecting on what gives life meaning. His subject was Jesus, not in the language of dogma or theological complexity, but in the language of lived experience, in the simplicity of love, sacrifice, and redemption. Jesus, Traoré began, is not merely a figure in history or a name in a book. For me, he represents the eternal struggle for truth and justice. He came not with armies, not with wealth, not with political power, but with compassion, humility, and courage. That is what moves me. That is what guides me. And it is what I wish for my people and for all humanity. Those words, spoken in a soft yet resolute tone, immediately drew Trump's attention. At first, the former president seemed to listen politely, nodding occasionally, perhaps expecting a familiar religious sentiment. Yet as Traoré continued, weaving together themes of liberation, forgiveness, and dignity, something began to change in Trump's demeanor. His famously sharp expression softened. His eyes blinked more often, and his jaw tensed as though he was holding something back. The viral clip captures the exact moment when Trump's hand moved, subtly toward his face, rubbing at his eye as if to dismiss a speck of dust. But it was not dust. Within seconds, his composure broke. His eyes grew red, and tears slid down his cheeks. For a man known for his defiance and self-control in front of cameras, this unguarded moment shocked not only those in the room but millions around the world, who would later watch it online. To understand why this scene struck so many people so deeply, one must look beyond the personalities involved and into the symbolism of the exchange. Ibrahim Traoré represents a younger generation of African leaders, unafraid to speak of spirituality in the same breath as politics, unafraid to anchor leadership in moral conviction. Trump, on the other hand, symbolizes the often cynical, transactional nature of Western politics, a world where vulnerability is hidden and power is measured in dominance. For these two figures to meet on the ground of faith, where one speaks and the other weeps, was nothing short of extraordinary. The introduction of the video clip spread rapidly across social media. Headlines describe it as a moment of unexpected grace, an encounter that shook the internet, and proof that even the most unlikely figures can be touched by words of faith. comment sections filled with thousands of remarks, some praising Traoré for his authenticity, others expressing surprise at Trump's visible tears, and many reflecting on their own relationship with faith and leadership. The conversation had transcended borders, languages, and political divides. But before the reactions, before the analyses, there was simply the moment itself. A revolutionary leader, seated across from one of the world's most controversial figures, spoke of Jesus not as an abstraction but as a living truth. And in that moment, cameras captured something rare: two men, shaped by vastly different worlds, joined in silence as one spoke and the other cried. The power of this introduction lies not just in the emotional drama, but in the universality of what it touched. Every culture, every nation, every human being understands loss, hope, and the search for meaning. Traoré's words carried that weight, reminding the world that leadership is not merely about commanding armies or drafting policies. It is about connecting to the deepest parts of human existence. And Trump's tears, whether one admires him or not, revealed something often hidden in political life: that even the powerful are vulnerable, and that even the seemingly unshakable can be moved by words of truth. The stage was set for what would become one of the most talked about conversations of the year. What followed was not just an interview, but a testament to the possibility of finding humanity across divides. The story begins here, in this moment of raw emotion, where silence spoke as loudly as words, and where the unexpected tears of a man became the reflection of a shared human longing for faith, hope, and redemption. When Ibrahim Traoré began to speak in greater depth, the atmosphere of the room shifted from quiet anticipation to profound silence. His words were not rehearsed, nor did they follow the polished cadence of a politician reading a statement. Instead, they carried the raw weight of a man speaking from his soul. Those who later watched the video would describe his tone as both firm and tender, like the voice of a leader who carries the burdens of his people, but refuses to let bitterness define him. Traoré leaned forward slightly, his eyes fixed not on the cameras but directly on Donald Trump, as if to remind him, and by extension, the entire audience, that what he was about to say was meant for the human heart, not just the political stage. He began with a simple but striking declaration. Jesus was never a ruler in the way we define rulers today. He commanded no armies, collected no wealth, and demanded no throne. And yet, his influence reshaped the world more than any empire, any king, or any president. Those opening words cut through the air like a knife. They were not meant to flatter, nor to provoke, but to reframe the entire concept of leadership. Traoré continued, explaining that in the struggles of Burkina Faso, a country often neglected by the global community, the teachings of Jesus provided a compass for justice, humility, and courage. He spoke of villages where people carried water for miles, of farmers who tilled the soil with little more than hope and perseverance, of children who dreamed of education despite poverty. And through all these stories, he wove a thread of faith. Jesus teaches us, he said, that true strength is not found in domination but in service. He showed us that the greatest act of leadership is sacrifice, not for oneself, but for others. And if a leader cannot sacrifice, if a leader cannot bear the burdens of his people, then he is not truly a leader. For a moment, the room seemed to hold its breath. Trump shifted in his seat, visibly moved yet still trying to mask his emotion. The camera captured his lips pressing tightly together, his posture leaning slightly back as if to create a shield. But the shield was breaking. Traoré's words grew more intimate, more personal. He spoke not only of his people but of his own journey, of nights spent questioning whether the fight for independence and dignity was worth the risk, of the loneliness of leadership, and of the constant temptation to give in to anger. He admitted that the burdens of power can sometimes crush a man's spirit. And yet, he said, it was the image of Jesus, alone, misunderstood, abandoned, but still full of love, that gave him the strength to continue. I ask myself, Traoré said softly, if he, the Son of Man, could forgive those who persecuted him, then who am I to carry hatred in my heart? If he could wash the feet of his disciples, then who am I to demand to be served? And if he could lay down his life for all humanity, then who am I to refuse sacrifice for my people? At these words, Trump's struggle to maintain composure became visible. His hands fidgeted slightly. His eyes blinked more rapidly. And one could see the tension in his jaw. Viewers would later debate endlessly what exactly touched him so deeply. Was it the reference to sacrifice, the reminder of humility, or simply the authenticity of a man who spoke without pretense? Whatever it was, the transformation on Trump's face was undeniable. Traoré did not stop there. He widened his scope, addressing the entire global community, as though the podcast table had dissolved and he was speaking directly to the world. We live in a time, he declared, where leaders fight for power, not for people, where policies are written for corporations, not for children, where borders divide us, but greed unites the few who exploit us. Jesus calls us to a different path. He calls us to justice that transcends politics, compassion that transcends culture, and truth that transcends fear. This is not about being Christian, Muslim, or any faith. It is about recognizing the sacred humanity in every soul. The words carried both a revolutionary edge and a deeply spiritual resonance. In them, Traoré managed to transcend categories. He was not simply a head of state, not simply a believer, but a man standing in defiance of the dehumanizing machinery of modern politics. For a leader from a small West African country to speak in this way, especially in the presence of a former US president, was a bold act. It challenged assumptions about where wisdom and authority are supposed to come from. It suggested that truth is not confined to wealth or military, might but can arise from places the world often ignores. As Traoré's words flowed, the studio remained silent except for the sound of his voice. The crew, accustomed to the noise of shifting equipment and whispered coordination, found themselves frozen in attention. Listeners would later say that they felt as though time itself had slowed down during this exchange, as though the world outside the studio had faded away. When Traoré paused, the silence that followed was not empty but full of reflection, full of the unspoken realization that something extraordinary had just been said. Trump lowered his head slightly, his shoulders slumping as if the weight of the message had pressed down on him. A tear, unhidden now, slipped down his cheek. The camera caught it, and that single image would become one of the most shared, most analyzed visuals of the year. Traoré, noticing Trump's reaction but not exploiting it, simply allowed the moment to exist. He did not gloat, he did not point it out. He did not shift his tone to capitalize on the emotion. Instead, he returned to the essence of his message. Leadership without love is tyranny. Leadership without sacrifice is selfishness. And leadership without faith, faith in God, in people, in the possibility of change, is nothing but emptiness. Those final words of his message resonated far beyond the studio walls. They struck at the heart of politics, religion, and humanity itself. Viewers who had grown cynical about global leaders suddenly found themselves inspired, if only for a moment, by the possibility that leadership could still be rooted in humility and truth. For Donald Trump, the effect was immediate and visible. For the world, the effect was lasting. For decades, Donald J. Trump cultivated an image of invulnerability. He was the man who relished in confrontation, who boasted of his resilience, who stood before massive rallies declaring that he alone could fix what was broken. To many, he symbolized arrogance, bravado, and an unshakable confidence that bordered on defiance. Yet, in this moment across the table from Ibrahim Traoré, the mask slipped, and for the first time in years, the world saw something unexpected: fragility. At first, Trump's reaction was subtle, almost imperceptible. As Traoré spoke of Jesus' sacrifice, Trump's hands fidgeted slightly with the edge of the table. His famously sharp eyes darted downward, no longer fixed on the speaker, but staring blankly into the grain of the wood as though trying to ground himself. He shifted in his seat, an unusual restlessness betraying his struggle to remain composed. The camera caught the moment when his lips tightened, pressing into a thin line, as if he were fighting an internal battle. Then came the blink, slow, deliberate, and followed by another, quicker one. The tears began to gather, glistening under the studio lights. He raised his hand to his face, brushing it across his eye as though dismissing dust. But the motion was unconvincing. Within seconds, the reality was undeniable. The former president of the United States was crying. For a man whose public persona had always leaned on strength and dominance, the sight was jarring. Trump was not merely misty-eyed or lightly emotional. He was visibly moved, his face flushed, his jaw quivering slightly as he tried to restrain the flood of emotion. He drew in a sharp breath, and the microphone caught the faintest tremor in his exhale. Viewers later dissected the moment endlessly. Some argued that it was the sheer sincerity of Traoré's words that pierced Trump's defenses. Others speculated that it awakened buried memories, perhaps of childhood Sunday school lessons, perhaps of private struggles long hidden from the public eye. Whatever the cause, the effect was unmistakable. Trump was no longer the defiant figure commanding the room, but a man exposed to his own vulnerability. The reaction of those in the studio was equally striking. The production crew exchanged nervous glances, unsure whether to cut the camera, zoom in, or simply let the scene unfold. The host sat frozen, perhaps aware that this was no longer just a podcast interview but a historic moment. No one moved, no one interrupted. The silence surrounding Trump's tears made them even louder, each drop of emotion amplified by the quiet reverence of the room. What made Trump's reaction so powerful was not just the fact that he cried, but how he cried. There was no grand gesture, no dramatic sobbing. Instead, it was the quiet, unguarded weeping of a man who, despite years of building walls around himself, could not resist the truth of the message before him. It was almost childlike in its honesty, as though a part of him that had been long buried suddenly surfaced. When Traoré spoke of forgiveness, of Jesus forgiving those who crucified him, Trump's expression shifted even further. His lips trembled slightly, and his eyes, now red with tears, seemed to reflect both pain and longing. Was it regret? Was it recognition? No one could say for certain. But the image of Trump, often accused of being hardened and unrepentant, grappling with the idea of forgiveness was enough to spark global debate. Psychologists who later commented on the clip suggested that Trump's tears revealed an essential human truth, that no matter how powerful, no matter how hardened, every person carries within them unresolved wounds and unspoken desires for redemption. Traoré's words, delivered with humility and conviction, had reached into a part of Trump that was rarely, if ever, visible to the public. The former president tried to recover his composure, but the attempt was transparent. He adjusted his posture, straightened his suit jacket, and cleared his throat, as if to signal that he was still in control. Yet when he finally spoke, his voice betrayed him. It was softer than usual, stripped of its typical bombast, almost hesitant. I didn't expect that, he admitted, his words halting. What you said, it's powerful. Very powerful. That simple acknowledgement, though brief, sent shockwaves through the room and, later, through the internet. Trump, the master of rhetoric and self-promotion, had no clever line prepared, no sharp retort, no boastful claim. He had only honesty, a raw, unpolished reaction that left millions stunned. Critics and supporters alike would analyze his reaction for weeks. Some saw it as a sign of weakness, arguing that a leader should never let emotions overwhelm him in public. Others saw it as the most humanizing moment of Trump's career, proof that beneath the bravado lay a man capable of deep feeling. Religious leaders praised the vulnerability, noting that even the powerful are not immune to the call of faith. But for those who watched it unfold in real time, there was no need for analysis. They saw a man confronted with truth, stripped of his defenses, and undone by the weight of it. They saw, for the first time in years, not a politician or a symbol, but a human being. Perhaps the most telling detail came not in the tears themselves but in what followed. As Traoré finished his message, Trump did not rush to speak, did not try to reclaim control of the conversation. Instead, he sat in silence, his gaze lowered, his breathing steadying as though he were absorbing the words. It was a silence heavy with meaning, a silence that spoke louder than any speech he could have given. For the millions who later watched the clip online, this was the heart of the story. Not simply that Trump cried, but that he allowed himself to be seen crying. In a world where leaders so often hide behind masks of strength and certainty, this vulnerability felt revolutionary in its own right. It reminded people that even those at the top of global power structures are not immune to the touch of truth. faith, and sincerity. In the end, Trump's surprising reaction did more than spark conversation. It redefined him. If only for a moment. It showed a side of him that few had ever seen. And it opened the door for reflection, not only on his humanity, but on the nature of leadership itself. Could it be that true? Leadership requires not only strength, but also the courage to be vulnerable? Could it be that tears, rather than diminishing authority, can sometimes illuminate it? As the clip continued to spread, these questions lingered. For Trump, the tears may have been a fleeting moment of weakness, soon replaced by his familiar bravado. But for the world, they were unforgettable. When the intensity of the moment began to soften, what followed was not a continuation of a typical interview, but a dialogue that seemed almost timeless. Ibrahim Traoré had spoken with conviction about Jesus, sacrifice, and the nature of true leadership. And Donald Trump, having been visibly shaken, now found himself in uncharted territory. For the first time in a long while, the former US president did not dominate the room. Instead, he listened. And when he finally spoke, it was not in the tone of a politician defending his record but in the voice of a man, grappling with questions bigger than himself. "You know," Trump said slowly, his voice still carrying a trace of vulnerability, "people always tell me I'm strong, that I fight, that I never back down. But strength, maybe I've been thinking about it the wrong way. Maybe strength is something else. What you said, it makes me think." Those words, halting but sincere, set the stage for a conversation that transcended politics. For a brief moment, Trump and Traoré were not former presidents or revolutionary leaders. They were simply two men, each burdened with the weight of leadership, seeking to understand what it truly means to guide others. Traoré leaned forward again, his expression calm, almost fatherly. "Strength," he replied, "is not the absence of fear or weakness. It is the willingness to carry them and still move forward. For me, Jesus is the model. He did not hide his tears. He did not hide his pain. He carried them openly, and still, he led. That is the kind of strength I believe in." Trump nodded, his eyes narrowing slightly as though he was digesting every word. For a man who built his career on projecting dominance, the idea that vulnerability could be a form of strength was a radical thought. He opened his hands on the table, palms facing upward, a gesture that seemed to symbolize a willingness to receive. "You know," Trump admitted, "I've had pastors around me. I've gone to church. People pray for me all the time. But it's always been formal, ceremonial. What you're talking about, it feels different. It feels real." The honesty in his words hung in the air. Traoré smiled gently, not in triumph but in empathy. "Because faith," he said, "is not performance. It is not ceremony. It is not something we wear like a costume. It is the fire inside us, the compass that guides us when the world offers no map. That is what Jesus gave us, not a religion of appearances, but a truth that transforms the heart." The dialogue deepened, moving beyond doctrine and into the realm of personal reflection. Trump asked questions, genuine questions, that revealed a rare side of him. "Do you ever doubt?" he asked. "Do you ever wonder if the sacrifice is worth it? If the people you fight for will understand, or even care?" Traoré paused before answering, his gaze steady. "Every day," he confessed. "Every leader who truly serves his people must wrestle with doubt. But that is why faith matters. It reminds us that we do not lead for applause, for approval, or even for recognition. We lead because we are called to. And even if no one understands, even if no one thanks us, we must still serve." Trump's expression softened again. The cameras caught a flicker of recognition, as though Traoré's words echoed a struggle he himself had known but rarely admitted. He had always thrived on applause, on loyalty, on visible displays of support. But here was another leader telling him that true service does not depend on such things. The conversation grew more profound. They spoke of humility, of the temptation of power, of the ways in which leaders are often isolated by the very positions they hold. Traoré shared how he often prayed for strength not to lose himself, not to allow the weight of power to corrupt his spirit. Trump listened intently, his usual interruptions absent, as though he too was searching for guidance. At one point, Traoré leaned closer and said softly, "Mr. Trump, you have carried great power. But power without humility is dangerous. And humility without faith is empty. A leader must hold all three, power, humility, and faith, in balance. That is the path Jesus showed us." Trump, visibly moved, responded with uncharacteristic quietness, "I've had power, more than most. But humility, I can't say I've always had that. Maybe that's why your words, they, hit me the way they did." The dialogue revealed something rare, a space where two leaders from vastly different worlds could connect not on policies, not on strategies, but on the fundamental questions of what it means to lead and to be human. For Trump, the exchange seemed to awaken a longing for something beyond success, beyond politics, beyond power. For Traoré, it was an opportunity to demonstrate that leadership, rooted in faith, can cross every cultural and political divide. The crew and the audience remained silent throughout, sensing that they were witnessing something historic. Social media would later explode with commentary. But in the studio, the moment belonged entirely to the two men. It was as though time had stopped, allowing them to speak not as symbols but as souls. As the dialogue drew to a natural pause, Traoré summarized his conviction. Leadership is not about building monuments to ourselves. It is about lifting others so they can stand taller, see further, and live with dignity. Jesus lifted humanity by lowering himself. That is the paradox of true leadership. Trump, still visibly affected, whispered almost inaudibly, "That's beautiful." For a man who so often used words as weapons, to reduce himself to a whisper of admiration was itself a transformation. In that whisper lay the acknowledgement that he had heard, understood, and perhaps even been changed, if only for a moment. The dialogue closed with silence once more, a silence heavy with reflection. Both men leaned back slightly, as though exhausted by the weight of their words, yet renewed by the truth they had uncovered together. It was not the kind of exchange that could be measured in political points or media headlines. It was something far deeper, a reminder that across cultures, across continents, across histories, faith and leadership remain universal languages. And for the millions who would later watch, the message was clear. Leaders are at their greatest not when they command armies, but when they reveal their hearts. The atmosphere inside the podcast studio was unlike anything the crew or the audience had experienced before. What had begun as a scheduled recording with two high-profile figures, one a revolutionary leader, the other a former US president, had transformed into something that felt almost sacred. The air seemed charged, as though the weight of the conversation between Ibrahim Traoré and Donald Trump had shifted the energy of the entire room. In most interviews, the studio was filled with subtle background noise, the quiet clicking of cameras, the whisper of producers exchanging instructions, the faint hum of air conditioning. But during Traoré's message and Trump's emotional reaction, all of those sounds seemed to disappear. There was no shuffling of papers, no nervous coughs, no interruptions. Instead, a heavy silence blanketed the room, not empty but overflowing with meaning. The crew, seasoned professionals who had filmed countless interviews, found themselves entranced. One cameraman later confessed that he forgot to adjust his focus because he was so captivated by the sight of Trump wiping away tears. A sound technician said he held his breath, fearing even the softest noise might break the spell. The producers, usually busy monitoring angles and timing, sat frozen in their chairs, as though they too had been pulled into the gravity of the moment. The lighting in the studio, designed to be soft and professional, took on a new quality. The warm glow highlighted the expressions of the two men, casting gentle shadows that gave the scene an almost cinematic feel. Trump's tear-streaked face glistened under the lights, every emotion laid bare. Traoré's steady gaze, illuminated with quiet conviction, seemed to radiate calm authority. Together, the contrasting images of vulnerability and strength created a tableau that could have been lifted from a painting. Observers in the room later described the feeling as otherworldly. One assistant said it was as if the walls of the studio dissolved, leaving only the table, the two men, and their words suspended in time. Another remarked that the silence carried the weight of prayer, as though the studio had momentarily become a sanctuary rather than a production space. The audience present, staff members, advisors, and a few invited guests, reacted in their own ways. Some clasped their hands together, their eyes moist with emotion. Others leaned forward, unable to look away, sensing that they were witnessing history in the making. A young intern in the corner quietly wept, moved not only by Traoré's words, but by the sight of Trump's unexpected vulnerability. The cameras captured everything. Every pause in Traoré's speech, every shift in Trump's posture, every glistening tear was immortalized in high-definition footage. Yet the magic of the moment was not in the recording itself, but in the collective stillness of those present. Everyone in the room, regardless of their personal beliefs or political leanings, felt that they were part of something larger than themselves. When Traoré paused after delivering his final words about leadership and sacrifice, the silence that followed was thick with reflection. It was not the awkward silence of a conversation, faltering but the reverent silence of people absorbing truth. The absence of applause or chatter only amplified the gravity of the exchange. It was as if no one dared to break the spell, as though even a cough might diminish the sacredness of what had just unfolded. Trump himself contributed to the atmosphere, not through words but through his silence. His bowed head, his trembling hands, his uncharacteristic restraint, all of these spoke volumes. For a man known for dominating every space he entered, his quiet vulnerability added an intensity that left everyone stunned. The studio's air felt heavy, as though saturated with emotion. Some later said it was difficult to breathe, not because of anxiety but because the moment carried so much weight. Others said they felt a strange sense of calm, as though they had been touched by something beyond politics and beyond explanation. It was this atmosphere, this unspoken, collective reverence, that elevated the conversation from a private dialogue to a universal moment. Without that silence, without that stillness, Traoré's words might have been heard but not felt. Trump's tears might have been noticed but not remembered. But in the quiet sanctuary of the studio, every detail became unforgettable. When the recording session ended, no one moved immediately. The usual rush of producers to stop the cameras, the scramble of assistants to gather notes, the chatter of crew members packing up equipment, all of it was delayed. For several long moments, the room remained frozen in contemplative stillness. It was as if everyone needed time to process what they had just experienced before returning to the ordinary rhythm of life. Even after the silence was eventually broken by a quiet cough, by the shuffle of a chair, by the soft instructions of a producer, something lingered. The atmosphere did not vanish. It clung to the walls, to the air, to the very memory of those present. Many later confessed that they carried the weight of that silence with them, long after they left the studio, replaying it in their minds like a sacred memory. It was this very atmosphere that gave the video its viral power once it was released. Viewers who had never set foot in the studio said they felt the silence through their screens. They described chills running down their spines, tears welling in their eyes, an unexplainable sense of being part of something profound. The atmosphere, captured on camera, transcended geography and language, reaching millions across the world. In the end, the atmosphere of the studio was not just a backdrop to the conversation. It was a participant. It amplified Traoré's words, magnified Trump's tears, and transformed the exchange into something unforgettable. It was proof that sometimes the most powerful moments are not filled with noise and applause, but with silence so heavy, it feels like the whole world is holding its breath. When the clip was finally released to the public, it spread like wildfire. Within hours, it had been shared across every major social media platform, accumulating millions of views. What struck viewers most was not simply the fact that two global figures had sat together, but the raw humanity of what transpired, the sincerity of Ibrahim Traoré's message and the vulnerability of Donald Trump's response. On Twitter, hashtags such as #TraoréandTrump, #FaithAndLeadership, and #UnexpectedTears quickly began trending. Users from across the political spectrum posted their reactions, often accompanied by clips, still images, or lengthy reflections. One user wrote, "I never thought I'd see Trump cry, let alone because of a message about Jesus from an African leader. This is history." Another commented, This proves that truth and faith can move even the hardest of hearts. Facebook communities lit up with debates. Religious groups shared the video as an example of the enduring power of spiritual testimony. Some called it a divine appointment, suggesting that God himself had orchestrated the encounter. Others were more cautious, noting that emotions do not necessarily indicate transformation, but still acknowledging the rarity of the moment. Instagram and TikTok amplified the emotional aspect, with short clips of Trump's tears paired with inspirational captions, music, and commentary. Young viewers, many of whom had little interest in either African politics or American leadership, found themselves deeply moved by the universality of the message. This isn't about politics, one TikTok user said. This is about being human. This is about faith and vulnerability. News outlets across the globe scrambled to cover the story. In the United States, networks from CNN to Fox News devoted segments to analyzing the moment. Some commentators praised Trump for showing a side of himself rarely seen in public, while others speculated about whether it would influence his political image. Conservative outlets highlighted Traoré's courage and authenticity, while more liberal voices focused on the irony of Trump, often criticized for his arrogance, being humbled by words of faith from a leader outside the Western sphere. In Africa, the response was particularly powerful. Traoré's speech was celebrated as a moment of pride, not just for Burkina Faso but for the continent as a whole. Newspapers describe him as a leader who had spoken truth to power on a global stage. Commentators noted the symbolism, an African revolutionary, often dismissed by Western powers, delivering a message that moved one of the most polarizing figures in modern American history. Social media users across the continent declared, "Africa is speaking, and the world is finally listening." European reactions were mixed but equally intense. In France, commentators reflected on the irony of Traoré, who had strongly opposed French influence in Africa, being the one to capture global attention in such a humanizing way. In the United Kingdom, church leaders praised the moment as evidence that faith still carries weight in the public sphere. German and Scandinavian outlets framed it as a reminder that leadership must be rooted in values, not just strategy. Religious communities worldwide also joined the conversation. Christian leaders hailed the event as a testament to the universality of the gospel. Many sermons that week referenced the clip, drawing lessons about humility, forgiveness, and the power of testimony. Muslim leaders, too, expressed respect for the way Traoré had framed his message, emphasizing that it was not exclusive to one religion, but spoke to a shared sense of justice and compassion. Even secular commentators acknowledged that the sincerity of his words transcended dogma. Not all reactions were positive. Skeptics accused the clip of being staged, questioning whether Trump's tears were genuine. Others dismissed the moment as political theater, designed to manipulate emotions rather than inspire real change. On online forums, debates raged. Was this a genuine encounter with truth, or a carefully orchestrated performance? Was Trump's reaction evidence of personal transformation, or merely a fleeting crack in his usual armor? Despite the skepticism, one fact remained undeniable: the video had struck a chord with millions. It forced conversations about faith in politics, about vulnerability in leadership, about the unexpected ways truth can surface. People who had long stopped paying attention to political speeches found themselves riveted by this exchange. The global impact went beyond social media chatter. Political analysts began to speculate on how the moment might reshape perceptions of both men. For Traoré, it elevated him from a regional revolutionary to a figure of international moral authority. For Trump, it complicated his public image, showing a side of him that even his critics could not ignore. In schools and universities, the clip was discussed in classes on leadership, politics, and ethics. Professors used it as a case study, asking students to analyze the dynamics of faith, vulnerability, and power. In churches, mosques, and temples, it was used as a sermon illustration about the universality of spiritual truth. In coffee shops and workplaces, ordinary people debated whether leaders should show more emotion, whether vulnerability is strength or weakness. Perhaps the most remarkable aspect of the global reaction was the sense of unity it created. However fleeting, for a brief moment, People across political, cultural, and religious divides shared a common sense of awe. Whether they admired or despised Trump, whether they supported or opposed Traoré's politics, they could not deny the power of what they had witnessed. In a world so often divided, the video became a rare point of connection. It reminded millions that beyond politics, beyond ideology, there are shared human experiences that bind us all: faith, vulnerability, and the search for meaning. And while the debates continued, the image of Trump's tears and Traoré's steady gaze remained, etched in the collective memory of a global audience. As the dust settled after the viral wave of reactions, analysts, religious leaders, politicians, and ordinary citizens alike were left asking a simple but profound question: was this just a fleeting viral moment? Or was it a turning point for global leadership? The encounter between Ibrahim Traoré and Donald Trump was remarkable not only for its emotional intensity but also for what it revealed about the current state of leadership in the world. For decades, politics had grown increasingly cynical, driven by strategy, polls, money, and power plays. Faith, humility, and vulnerability were often pushed to the margins, dismissed as weaknesses in the ruthless arena of global affairs. And yet, here was a moment that shattered those assumptions. In Traoré's words, the world saw a reminder that leadership rooted in sacrifice and compassion is not only possible but desperately needed. He represented a generation of leaders who refused to separate moral conviction from political responsibility, who see faith not as a private ritual but as a public compass. For Africa, his testimony was a declaration of dignity, a reminder that wisdom and moral authority can emerge from places the world too often overlooks. In Trump's tears, the world saw something equally important: the universality of human vulnerability. Whether one admires or despises him, whether one views him as a statesman or a symbol of division, the moment revealed that even the most powerful are not immune to the call of truth. It reminded people that beneath the armor of ego and ambition, every leader is still a human being, longing for meaning, forgiveness, and redemption. The question, of course, is whether such a moment can truly change anything. Skeptics argue that once the cameras stopped rolling, the world returned to its usual patterns of conflict and division. They point out that a single emotional exchange cannot erase years of political maneuvering, nor can it guarantee genuine transformation in those involved. But others see it differently. They argue that history is shaped not only by policies and wars but also by moments of revelation, moments when the world pauses, reflects, and remembers its shared humanity. The tears of a president, the words of a revolutionary, the silence of a studio-turned-sanctuary. These may seem small compared to the machinery of politics, but they carry symbolic power. Symbols inspire, symbols endure, and sometimes, symbols ignite change. In the weeks and months after the clip went viral, its impact was felt in subtle but significant ways. Faith communities across the globe used it as a rallying point to remind believers that truth can speak even in unlikely places. Educators used it as a teaching tool, encouraging students to think critically about what leadership really means. Activists cited it as evidence that leaders must be held to a higher moral standard, not just a political one. For Ibrahim Traoré, the moment cemented his reputation as more than just a regional figure. He became a global voice for moral leadership, admired even by those far outside Africa. His insistence on grounding politics in faith and humanity resonated across cultures, proving that the language of truth is universal. For Donald Trump, the tears created a paradox. On one hand, they humanized him in ways his carefully crafted persona never had. Supporters saw the moment as evidence of his depth, his openness to being moved. Critics, however, debated whether the vulnerability was genuine or temporary. Regardless, the tears added a new dimension to his public image, one that could not be easily dismissed. Beyond the individuals involved, the encounter raised a broader question. What kind of leadership does the world need in the 21st century? The old model, defined by dominance, control, and power, seems increasingly insufficient in a world facing crises of climate, inequality, and division. The new model, hinted at in this conversation, points toward leadership defined by humility, compassion, and the courage to be vulnerable. Perhaps the most enduring legacy of the event lies in its ability to spark conversation across divides, conservatives and progressives, believers and skeptics, Africans, Americans, and people across every continent. Millions found themselves reflecting on the same moment. In an age where division dominates headlines, such shared reflection is itself extraordinary. Was it a turning point? Only time will tell. True change is rarely immediate, and the forces of cynicism and power are not easily overcome. Yet even if the clip fades from the news cycle, its memory remains etched in the collective consciousness. It stands as a reminder that leadership without humanity is empty, and that even the hardest hearts can be moved by sincerity. The studio moment between Ibrahim Traoré and Donald Trump may not have rewritten geopolitics. It may not have ended wars or solved global crises. But it did something perhaps equally important. It reminded the world that, beneath the titles, beyond the borders, and above the noise, we are all searching for the same things: truth, faith, and the courage to lead with love. And in that sense, perhaps it truly was a turning point, not of policy, but of perspective, not of power, but of purpose. The world may forget the words of countless speeches, but it will not forget the sight of a revolutionary speaking truth with conviction, nor the sight of a president weeping before that truth. That image, etched into history, will continue to inspire, challenge, and provoke long after the headlines have moved on. Because sometimes, history is not changed by armies or governments, but by tears, silence, and the courage to speak with sincerity.